Hi everyone. So today we're starting in with the sensory organs. Today we're going to talk about general sensation, and then I'll do a second video on the smell and the taste. I'm going to group those together because they're very, very similar. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. Okay, so let's first start with talking about sensory receptors. These are specialized cells that are excitable, which means that they are able to create electrical impulses. They depolarize, which just means they change in charge, which is electricity. And there are two different types. We have neurons, so these would be sensory neurons that both receive the sensory input and take it all the way to the brain. Then we also have modified epithelial cells that then synapse or connect to sensory neurons. So for example, in the ear, we're going to talk about in a while, we're going to talk about the hair cells. They're called hair cells because they have these little hair-like extensions, but they are modified epithelial cells that then connect to a sensory neuron, and then the sensory neuron creates the axons that become the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves that takes the hearing information to the brain. Okay, so let's talk about ways to classify those sensory receptors. There's two different ways. You can classify them based on where the information is gathered from, and then you can classify them by what type of stimulus activates those cells. So let's talk about the stimulus source first. So if you're trying to classify them by where the information comes from, there are three classifications for that. We have exteroceptors, and exteroceptors receive information from outside of the body. So even your special senses, sight and taste and smell, all of those are external stimuli, and so all of those would be grouped together as exteroceptors. It also includes all of those general sensations that we're going to talk about in just a minute: touch, temperature changes, pain, those kinds of things. But anything that is on the outside of your body, that is exteroceptors. And then interoceptors, just kind of what it sounds like, is internal stimulus. And so this is the way that your body monitors what's happening inside of you to make sure that you're maintaining a constant state, homeostasis. So for example, monitoring what's happening with your intestines, monitor the food as it goes through. Anything that's inside of your body would be interoceptors. Okay, so external, intero, internal. Now, here's the third one. The third one is a little bit trickier. For the third one, the proprioceptors, those are any of the receptors that are monitoring body positioning or tendon stretch. Okay, so those are those are going to bring information to the brain. Anything related to how your body is moving around, that is a proprioceptor. Okay, so please note that these classifications are very, very broad classifications, and we're going to get down to much more specific neuron types. Okay, so the second way to classify sensory receptors is based on what type of stimuli activate them. There are 4 functional classifications, and on a quiz, or if I ever say functional classifications, I'm looking for one of these 4. We have chemoreceptors, photoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and mechanoreceptors. Now, usually people are pretty okay with the first 3. Chemoreceptors respond to chemicals, photoreceptors respond to photons of light, which is, vision. Thermoreceptors respond to thermal changes or temperature changes. So people usually get those ones pretty easily. The mechanoreceptors is a little bit more challenging of a concept. What it does is it responds to mechanical changes in the cell. So what we really mean by that is changes in shape. Anytime there's bending, or if you make a depression based on touch or pressure, any change in shape of the cell that activates it, that would be a mechanoreceptor. So those would be things like the hair cells in the ear, that once we get to those pressure receptors, all of those would be mechanoreceptors because they're responding to mechanical changes in the cell. Okay, so please note that these ones, this type of way to classify it is much more narrow than the classification based on source. These are very, very broad. So for example, that exteroreceptor, that is going to include all 4 of these inside of exteroreceptors. So exteroreceptors is by far the broadest way to classify it. Okay. Let's get into some of those exteroreceptors. Extero meaning external. So we're going to start with general senses, and general senses are different from special senses because special senses are sensations that only come through one particular sense organ. For example, sight, only see through our eyes; smell, only smell through our nose. Whereas general sensation just means like body-wide. And another way to say this would be cutaneous sensations that come from through the skin. So cutaneous as in skin. So those are things like sense of touch or pressure or changes in temperature or pain receptors. And they're going to be mediated or sort of sensed by sensory neurons, and there are 2 different types of sensory neurons. You have free nerve endings. Free nerve endings means that the dendrite ends are free, and encapsulated means that they're covered with layers. Okay, so for example, this right here, this is the Pacinian cortical. It has several, lots and lots of layers covering. Encapsulate means to cover that the end of the dendrite. And what I'd like you to understand is the more encapsulation you have, the more layers surrounding it, the less sensitive that free nerve ending will be. The less sensitive that nerve ending will be. Okay, so let's answer this question right here. So we're going to look at several different types of receptors, and all of these touch and pressure receptors and thermoreceptors are all located in which layer? What is the name of this middle layer of the skin? So epidermis on top, the middle is the, oops, sorry, oh, I didn't answer that. The middle is the dermis, and the bottom would be the hypodermis. So all of these receptors are going to be found in the dermis, the middle layer of the skin. Okay, let's look at temperature first. For temperature changes are quite sensitive, and so they're going to be mediated by those free nerve endings. No, it's not wrapped in anything, they're free. And there are 2 different types of temperature receptors, and please note that these would be thermoreceptors for the functional classification. We have cold temperature receptors and warm temperature receptors. All this means is the cold ones are activated as the temperature goes towards cold, and the warm receptors are going to be activated as it goes towards warm. So what these really do is they are activated by changes in temperature, not just pure temperature. So anytime you swing towards cold or swing towards warm. The other thing I'd like you to understand is the cold receptors, they are found in the upper dermis, and the warm receptors are going to be found further down in the dermis. So which of these 2 do you think would be more sensitive, cold or warm? The answer is cold. The closer you are to the surface, the more sensitive you're going to be, and that's why the sensation of cold is so much more jarring than the sensation of warm, because they are much more sensitive than warm receptors. Also, the warm receptors, they can respond to a chemical, which is kind of strange because usually you have thermoreceptors that only respond to changes in temperature, but they can actually respond to one specific type of chemical, and that's called capsaicin. Where do you find capsaicin? Does anybody know that word, capsaicin? It's found in food, spicy food, hot food. Okay, and the reason we call it hot is because it activates these warm receptors, and it's the sensation that goes to your brain is interpreted as warm, as hot. Okay, so even though it's a chemical, it activates those warm receptors, and therefore it's interpreted as a change in temperature, not a chemical, which is kind of interesting. Okay, let's go into touch. Now there's two different types of touch receptors. You have touch receptors, which are for fine touch, and then you have a different receptor that's for deep pressure. The one that is for fine touch is called the Meissner's corpuscle. Corpuscle just means like body, just like a solid circle body. Meissner's is the specific type of touch receptors, and they are going to be located right up near the epidermis. So here we have the epidermis. See, it's solid cells. That's the stratified squamous epithelium that makes up the epidermis there. It's right underneath it. It's in the papillary layer of the dermis, so right up next to it, and that's why you can get very small, fine touch. And so this would be activated when the depression of the touch deforms or changes the shape of the cell. So what would be the functional classification of a Meissner's corpuscle? That would be mechanoreceptor. So mechanoreceptor because it activates when it changes the shape of the cell. And it's right up near the top, so it'll be nice and fine. The second type of touch receptor, which is usually called the pressure receptor because it requires deeper pressure, that is the Pacinian corpuscle. And the Pacinian corpuscles tend to be found much, much deeper into the dermis. And on top of that, they have a lot more layers. So if you looked at them under the microscope, they kind of look like these onions where they got circles and circles and circles of encapsulated layers. And that makes it so that they're only going to be activated when you have deep pressure. And that's how your brain is sort of able to interpret the difference in pressure intensity, right? So fine ones will only activate the Meissner's corpuscle, and then these ones are only going to be activated with deep pressure. And that's how you're able to determine how deep the pressure is. So Pacinian corpuscle, I'd like you to know that name. You can think of those as the onion ones. Okay, on to pain. So one thing that I do want to mention about pain is that there's a lot of different types of stimuli that can be interpreted as pain. Usually it's any type of stimuli that is extreme in any way. So extreme changes in temperature, either hot or cold. Those of you ever digging through ice, your fingers hurt. And extreme harmful chemicals can be interpreted as pain, deep pressure. Anything that is extreme usually can activate these free nerve endings, and those will take information to the brain, and your brain will interpret that as pain, right? So it's a lot of different types of receptors can create the sensation of pain. Oh, one thing I did want to mention, because I think it's fascinating, is that you have pain receptors everywhere in your body, inside your body, so exteroceptors, internal receptors, but you do not have any pain receptors in your brain, which is why they can actually do brain surgery while the patient is awake. So think about that for a second. Okay, so exteroceptors on the outside. Interoceptors means on the inside, monitoring what's happening with your intestines or at your joints, or whether or not your bladder is full, those kinds of things. There is one that I wanted to give you as an example, primarily because this is, if you do go into physiology, this is definitely going to come up. Let's briefly talk about the Baroreceptor Reflex. What this is here, so here's your heart. Oops. Here's your heart. This is the aorta, which is the biggest artery, and this right here is the carotid artery. And embedded in the walls of the major arteries, you have these receptors. Those are called baroreceptors. And what they are, they're mechanoreceptors that will activate when the blood vessel wall stretches. So when the blood pressure increases, so increase in blood pressure, that's going to make it so that the blood is pushing on the wall more. That would stretch the blood vessel more. That'll then take the information to the brain, Once it's in the brain, that's going to trigger a response that's going to decrease heart rate, and that will make it so that the blood pressure will go back down. So the purpose of these baroreceptors is to help maintain constant cardiac output. So really it is about homeostasis, which is the staying at a very consistent internal environment despite changes in the external environment. Okay, so this is just an example of an interoreceptor because you're monitoring what's happening inside of the body. Okay, proprio as in body positioning. There are two ones that I want you to know. The first one is called a muscle spindle. And if you look at those skeletal muscles here, some of the skeletal muscles are going to be wrapped around with a sensory nerve fiber. So here we have the dendrite of a sensory neuron. It wraps around some of those muscle fibers. They're called intrafusal fibers, by the way. And what it does is it monitors those muscles, so those long cells, monitors them for stretch, so that when they are stretched, that's going to send information to the brain, and then it'll cause a response, and the response is going to be contraction. So what I'd like you to understand is that the response opposes or goes against the initial change, right? So it's stretched out and then it contracts back down. And the whole point of the muscle spindles is to prevent changes in the length of the muscle. And this is how you're able to maintain posture, so that if you're just standing there, you're not trying to move, you can make sure that you stay nice and still, and it helps sort of stabilize your muscles. Okay, and so the muscle spindles help maintain the proper posturing, or muscle tone, if you've ever heard that term before. Okay, and then the second one is a Golgi tendon. So please note that the muscle spindles wrap around the skeletal muscle cells. The Golgi tendon organs, they are found in the tendons. Okay, it's a similar idea though. So if we're looking at this picture, the blue kind of squiggly lines right there, or the lighter blue, I should say, the lighter blue squiggly lines, those are the collagen fibers. Remember, in dense regular connective tissue, all the collagen fibers are running parallel to each other. Wrapped around some of those collagen fibers is the receptive endings of sensory neurons. And those sensory neurons are going to take that information to the brain. And what they do is they help coordinate stretching and extension of the muscles, so that your brain knows what's happening with the muscles, whether or not it's pulling on the bones or not pulling on the bones. And this is especially important for complex movements such as walking, where you have an alternating flexion and extension, a flexion and extension. So that's a little bit confusing. And so this helps kind of smooth all of that out. So which area of the brain is responsible for taking this information and helping to smooth all that out so that you have nice coordinated movements? That would be the cerebellum. Okay, so these sensory neurons are going to travel to the cerebellum. The cerebellum will use that information to coordinate the movement, the motor movement that's coming in from the primary motor cortex, to make sure that everything's all smoothed out and coordinated, so that you have that alternating flexion and extension. Okay, so you can look at this response if you stretch the muscle. Okay, so the patellar stretch reflex, this is looking at the spindle muscle, the spindle apparatus, the muscle spindles in the muscles. And so what happens there, if you tap on the tendon right underneath the patella, what that does is that stretches the rectus femoris muscle, which is the quadricep muscle up here. And when it stretches it, that sends the information to the brain, and then the response would oppose it. Okay, so what would be the normal response? What action is happening right here? That would be called leg extension, or you could say knee extension. So notice that it's stretched out and then it contracts to oppose that response. Okay, and generally, if you're just sort of standing there, you wouldn't even notice these changes here. just a small, minute adjustment to the posture. Okay, so what I want you to do right now, and this is the last thing before I'm finished with this lecture piece, I want you to go ahead and pause it, and I want you to put the following words in order from broad to specific, because I gave you a bunch of different terms, and I need you to understand how they fit together. Okay, so of these three terms, what is the most specific and what is the broadest? Exteroceptor, mechanoreceptor, and Pacinian corpuscle. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to figure that out. The biggest one would be exteroceptor, because exteroreceptor is anything that's on the outside of the body. And then mechanoreceptors is a specific functional classification. So for example, those touch receptors, those are mechanoreceptors because they respond to changes in shape of the cell. And then the most specific is the Pacinian corpuscle. The Pacinian corpuscle is a specific type of receptor that responds to deep pressure. So the Pacinian corpuscle would be an example of a mechanoreceptor, and the mechanoreceptors can fall under exteroreceptors. Okay, that's enough for now. I'll come back for special senses.